So welcome everyone to the first constitutional conversation from the Constitutional Law Center of Stanford Law School for this academic year. Before I introduce our guest, I just wanted to mention that we had planned a full set of constitutional conversations on the expectation that we would be able to meet in person and that our guests from around the country would be able to come in person. And because of the renewed problems with the Delta variant and thus the more stringent COVID restrictions, we've alas had to move in the wrong direction. Nobody's happy about that. And what we did was we gave each of the speakers the option of either postponing their conversation or appearing with us via Zoom, in the hope that some, like Julie here this evening, would soldier on with Zoom. And so that's why those of you who are regular attendees, that's why we're having fewer programs than you might have expected, but we will come through this eventually, and with everyone healthy, I hope and trust. So, in any event, for our first constitutional conversation of the academic year, I welcome Julie Owono. Julie has actually assumed a Stanford position since accepting this invitation, but at the time that she was originally coming, she has been a long time officer and leader of a very important global institution called, and my French is terrible, but Julie will correct me, I hope, Internet Sans Frontières, Internet Without Frontier. Julie is herself born in Cameroon and is a French citizen. Recently, she's come to the United States for study, but I think that's not permanent. She is also one of the members of the Facebook Oversight Board, and so she is practicing what she preaches in terms of trying to apply democratic principles to the very challenging problems of social media. And that's what she's going to be talking about this evening. Now, more recently, she has come to Stanford and is let me make sure I have the exact title here. She's one of the co-directors of the policy, Internet Policy and Society Lab, which is under the rubric of the Stanford program on democracy and the internet. So she's going to be doing research on the topics that she is talking about tonight. But in the meantime, please join me in welcoming Julie Owono.
Thank you very much, Michael, Professor McConnell, for the great introduction. Your French was perfect, Americanly French, perfect. So thank you. Yes, I'm very honored and to be the first, and also extremely thrilled to have this conversation tonight with you. I thought it was, well, when Professor McConnell reached out and sent me this invitation to discuss this topic, well, the general topic of internet and constitution, internet and democracy. I was extremely enthusiastic to do it because I think we're really at a crossroads, where these conversations need to be had. So without further ado, I'll jump into the subject, and I will share with you a short presentation that I prepared, hoping with the hope that we'll focus on the discussion. So let me close this. Fantastic. So the title that I chose to give, based on some inspiration that Professor McConnell shared with me, was it will be about the new Gutenberg, why the internet matters to democracy in countries with less stable public institutions. I choose this, expression less stable because it's, where all the countries virtually around the world are at different levels, institutions-wise. We remember, President Obama's speech when he was in Ghana, and he reminded that, stronger institutions were extremely important for a country. So I like to use this expression to, situate a bit more what I'm talking about. And oops, sorry about that. I have a little technical, the joys of Zoom, right? Right, okay, I'll do like this. And as a matter of introduction, since we are at a law school, and my memory of my own classes when I was at the law school at La Sorbonne in Paris is that we always have to start with definitions, right? Understanding what we're talking about. While I will not define all the words that I just, put together as a title for this conversation, I wanted to focus more on the Gutenberg, name and the idea that it conveys. It is true that there is a popularized idea that indeed the internet is a bit like the printing revolution that Johannes Gutenberg brought us a few centuries ago. Don't ask me to do the math, please, at 5 p.m. I'm really not good at that, but some time ago. And I reflected when Professor McConnell suggested this, I reflected and I told myself, what does actually that analogy mean? And I did a bit of research, or, try to think into my memories what that analogy could mean. And really what it's about here is the democratization of knowledge and the impact that this has on societies in general and political systems particularly. And with the case of Gutenberg, we know what happened after that. We know about the Renaissance in Europe, we know about the French Revolution and the others that followed. So, and we also remember that, well, the church, the Catholic Church, which was the superpower of the time, we remember how much power that institution lost gradually after the democratization of knowledge through the printing, the ability to print faster information and share them through networks of publishers. So the internet is kind of a bit the same, this idea that an innovation, a technological revolution can have such an impact on society and our political systems. With the internet, it's exactly the same. Here is this invention, French originally, but we can talk about that later, and also American, but now global, truly. Here's this innovation that was brought to the world and that has tremendously impacted our societies. I would say even that there is a kind of proportion between the speed with which information traveled at the Gutenberg time and at the internet time, and the speed of changes that it brought. Gutenberg probably took 2-3 centuries. Here with the internet, it's only we only have 25 years, especially with the web. We only have 25 years to look back and remember all the changes that have happened. So it's some of these changes that I wanted to focus on today, and focus particularly on the political systems that were impacted by internet. And I'll focus mostly here on democracy. We're talking about, Constitutional Law Center, and a well-functioning democracy should have, of course, a constitution. But we will see that probably internet has helped advance, or at least created a debate in favor of democracy, or at least a democratic debate in so many countries on so many issues. And I'll use some case studies here that are taken from the news, and which the fact that I took them from the news shows the extent to which we're really into this changing world. So the first example that I wanted to share is the case of Kenya. Kenya, a country, powerful Eastern African country. Well, if you remember the recent history, 2007, there were there were violence, electoral violence after the election, the contested election that happened, and thousands of people were killed. I mean, injured, killed, or wounded. And so out of this drama, basically, out of this tragedy, was emerged a movement of citizens, regular Kenyan citizens, really, who at the time were discovering not even smartphones, telephones. I don't even think there were that many smartphones at the time in Kenya, but they had this tool that allowed them to communicate rapidly and share information rapidly, even through limited online connectivity. And what happened is that in 2007, after this happened, a group of Kenyan citizens came together, partnered with American engineers, technologists, and created a tool that is very well known now in the development sector, particularly, which is called Ushahidi. Ushahidi is a platform that does what we call now crowdsourcing. So basically, you create a map and you create a telephone number. That's how it works at the time, a short code, SMS code. And through that map and through that number, people can send reports to that number. And those reports will be reported on the map that you put out. So for instance, in 2010, when there was an earthquake in Haiti, well, Ushahidi was deployed by the UN to help people communicate where there may have been victims left under the rumbles. So this Ushahidi tool was created in 2007, first to locate where the wounded were in the aftermath of the violent protest that erupted after the election, the contested election. And this tool further inspired another usage of this crowd mapping, crowdsourcing, technological innovation, and they used it to create an electoral monitoring map. And in this case, the election, it wasn't really an election, it was a constitutional referendum, because after the contested election, there was a period of, I would say, amnesty. I mean, the country came together and decided to create new institutions through a referendum on a new constitution. And people during the vote could use a platform directly inspired from Ushahidi, through which they could send report about irregularities in the referendum process. So for instance, if you wanted to cast your vote, but the ballot that was given to you was a yes ballot in favor of the constitution, and you didn't have both, for instance, that is a type of irregularity that could be reported. And it created a level of transparency that was never achieved before, even with the myriads of processes that were put in place, including international and regional election monitoring bodies. The second case that I wanted to discuss with you about today is a recent one, which concerns Russia. So you may be aware that Google and Apple have been asked to take down from their app stores, well, Apple Store for Apple and Play Store for Google, have been asked to take down an app that has been developed by Navalny and his sympathizers, his militants, which aim to report, first of all, to map protests against the parliamentary election. Russia just had a parliamentary election through which the ruling party of Vladimir Putin, United Russia, was reelected. Majority again at the Duma. And this app was supposed to allow people to know where the protests would happen, and also allow them to report repression of the said protest, because we remember that just a few months ago, we remember those images of violently repressed protests in Russia. So this app has been banned. Google and Apple complied with the orders, which raises, of course, a lot of human rights questions that I'm very familiar with, but it also raises the question of how the electoral transparency, how technology has been able to push forward electoral transparency around the world. I just gave the example of Kenya, I just gave the example of Russia. There are many more. So this is one aspect that I wanted to discuss with you. The other example, which is more of an emerging issue, which is cryptocurrency and monetary sovereignty. So cryptocurrencies are a new set of currencies that function on the principles of the web, decentralized, so that no one has centralizes the control of how information flows, decentralization, and encryption, which is another important aspect, security feature to protect transactions and also protect the currencies. And the last aspect that the cryptocurrencies bring in is sorry, I said, sorry, I have a blank here. But yes, there are several aspects that the cryptocurrency has brought within the financial debate. And well, there have been several reactions to that. On the one hand, you have, of course, those who are open to that, who see this as a disruption, a necessary disruption of monetary institutions, banks particularly, who are perceived as groups, lobbies who have so much power over our money. And on the other hand, there are other people who are more critical, and in this case, I would say there are lots of governments who are critical, especially from the monetary perspective, monetary sovereignty perspective. This idea that you would have a currency that is not controlled by the state is perceived as, I don't want to say threatening, but at least not adapted, or at least, not suited enough for certain countries. I'll give some examples of countries that have banned cryptocurrencies. Ecuador first was in favor of adopting a cryptocurrency, but later on banned totally cryptocurrencies, especially when they're not centrally, when there is no central institution that manages the circulation of that currency. And countries like Nigeria, countries like Turkey, so many countries that are actually quite wary of this disruption. And there are other countries where the debate is slightly different. And these countries, still in the monetary sovereignty debate, these countries are located in West and Central Africa. Those countries, which also happen to be former colonies of France, have a common currency called the CFA franc, the franc CFA in French. And it was created in 1945, I think, right after the liberation of, the end of the Second World War. It was created by during in the time de Gaulle was the de facto leader of France. And I'm mentioning this because it has been perceived, it has been portrayed and criticized as being a neocolonial instrument at the hands of France, of French institutions, political institutions particularly. And there are several criticism. I will not necessarily get into the details. So for many people, many activists, many politicians in those countries, cryptocurrencies could actually act as a way to counter that perceived neocolonial instrument. It's probably important that I did dive a little bit into how that currency functions. So it's a currency that is pegged to the euro. So any decision that is made within the euro space will impact the value and the course of the currency worldwide. And not only that, it has a lot of other subtleties, but for instance, it would be difficult for me to come here in the US with my CFA francs. It would be very difficult for me to exchange that currency in exchange of dollars. And last but not least, criticism based on that neocolonialism perception is that in the central banks that manage this money, there is, I think, usually 1 or 2 seats that are reserved for representatives of the Central Bank of France, representatives who have a veto right on decisions that are made within those central banks. So here, cryptocurrencies are perceived as a possibility to evade that, that instrument, monetary instrument that does not satisfy the needs of the expressed needs of certain groups in certain African countries. And last but not least, example of this connectivity between internet, democracy, constitutional rights is, of course, what happens in case of political instability. Internet, and especially the infrastructure that support it, are, of course, virtual, but they're really physical. They're also very physical. You know that to provide internet, you need a physical infrastructure, such as an undersea cable, for instance, and then you need in-country physical infrastructures as well to take the bandwidth inside the country, from the coast, because the undersea cables are located near the coast, from the coast to the interland. And that is posing currently a lot of troubles, a lot of preoccupations in Afghanistan, where a military force, insurgent force, has taken over the power, the democratic, the political power, the civilian political power. And Afghanistan has had internet, so there are infrastructures. And who is gonna, how are the Taliban going to manage those? That's a very interesting and important question, especially when we know that in their military advance, the targeting of this internet infrastructure was very central in the agenda of, the military advance of the Taliban. So this is an interesting aspect to mention. And last but not least, increasingly our democratic life is being digitalized. Our citizens' life is being democratized. You can vote, well, in certain countries, you can vote electronically through a machine. You can file your taxes online in the US and in many other countries. So there are significant aspects of your citizen life which are online. And this is even more accurate when we talk about digital identity. So the identity that you have online that matches the physical analog identity that you have in the physical world. So a lot of governments are pushing for digital identity adoption, biometrics, that involves, of course, the taking of biometrics to make sure that we really match your physical and your virtual identity. And that infrastructure, biometric infrastructure, digital ID infrastructure, has been taken over by, of course, the Taliban. So what does that mean for citizens of Afghanistan? These are pending questions. Hopefully we will find responses soon, and it will, of course, depend on the international response, the international relations response that will be given to this group. So these were some case studies, and I'm happy to discuss more examples. I would really be curious to know how you think through these issues and some examples that you may have come across. But before I close this chapter, this presentations chapter, I wanted to reflect on what next, what will come next. Okay, with brush a big picture with some case studies. So what should we reflect on as we are ending this presentation? I think the first one is, and connected to the last point that I made, which is the increased digitalization of our life, citizens' life. The first one is that connectivity becomes urgent, and it's become a fundamental right. If you don't have connectivity today, especially in a post-COVID-19 world, where we are hopefully, no matter the recent Stanford news, but hopefully where we are transitioning now, well, this post-COVID world will be 100% or 95% online. What to do for those who are not online? Do they not exist? How to match their political identity as citizens offline that exist and will continue to exist because the world goes on. But what will happen if there is a dissonance between those who can have an existence and match that existence online as well with those who cannot? That's a philosophical question, but I think it's also a legal question. with regards to your existence. If you cannot file your taxes online, what will happen when we transition to 100%, system, online system? So this will require, I think, institutional adaptability, and this is a bigger conversation, I think, that goes beyond, just the political, discussing with the executive or the parliamentary that will, help us adopt the necessary regulations that will help us transition to that digital transition. But I think it also involves the judicial community. How are we on this? Increasingly, court systems have also transitioned online. So how are we making sure that the rights, their role to safeguard our constitutional, fundamental rights, civil rights, penal, you name it, rights, how are we making sure that they're equipped, that this body, the legislative body, the judiciary body is equipped to adapt to that? Not only the judicial, but even the executive. Honestly, a lot of them do not have a clue. I'm not being, disrespectful here, but it's a reality. Not everyone really understands what is at stake when we talk about digitalization, internet, especially for the society. So there is a need for adaptability and learning. And last but not least, I think what the internet is going to bring much more is this notion that there is room for collaboration, right? First of all, collaboration in designing what the digital future will mean. And in that sense, I think from a political perspective, it's extremely interesting, and a legal perspective as well, because to some extent, in certain countries, it resembles the adoption of a constitution. When the constitutional body, which is the people, is united to think about together collectively what future, what laws, what rules do we want for ourselves. And I think that is happening even in the digital space, and when it comes to internet particularly. I'm thinking as an example of Brazil, where in 2014, a Marco Civil, it's called the Marco Civil, I'm not pronouncing right, it's in Portuguese, which means it's kind of an internet bill of rights, right? What is the Bill of Rights of the internet? I think this, and it was defined collaboratively, so proposed by the government and then with inputs from the population. So this collaborative aspect is going to be increased in the future. So it's also important to be aware of that. So yes, that is all I wanted to share with you today, but I look forward to continuing the conversation right now with the questions and your, I'm not sure there are interventions, but at least questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Julie. That was great. Yeah, we have lots of questions, so let's just go ahead and dive in. So one of the great questions that we received is from another Stanford affiliate who would love to hear your thoughts on the appropriate responses to technologies that are used in quote unquote good ways to evade bad governments in some contexts, but that are also used in bad ways to evade good governments in other contexts. You talked about cryptocurrency, the questioner asks, but another example might be via VPNs or other geo-blocking circumvention tools that are used to access content that's been blocked under some nations' laws. Are there any general principles this audience member wonders for thinking about these kinds of examples?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. It's a question of balance. How should we approach the fact that what I think is rather a minority of bad actors, but that's a very personal point of view. I do not have data to back that up, but it's from experience. Well, how should we approach the fact that a minority are obviously going to evade the rules and are going to weaponize the good tools? And that is absolutely a question that I've been asking myself all the time, and with my organization, my coworkers, and in other settings. And for that, for me, the principle should always be the openness to those tools, because I understand that encryption is not good, because in more stable countries, let's call them like that, there are groups that are using that to perform bad, well, terror attacks. Typically, that is a good, example. I mean, a good the example mostly used, but also, well, drug dealers, etc. But on the other hand, you also have people who were legitimately concerned about censorship, the fact that their government will censor social media platforms in the name of fighting hate speech and fake news, when actually the aim is to control information. So our proposition on this is, first of all, by principle, remain open, because be as permissible as possible, because there are lots of good things that can happen. And secondly, I think it's interesting and important also to collaborate, back to my presentation earlier, collaborate a little bit more with organizations on the ground or communities. There are lots of initiatives around, especially in the encryption community, about community moderation, for instance. We've talked briefly about that in the introduction. Community policing, basically, of the space. So there are some ideas around that, but there's not one size fits all solution, sorry, obviously, as it is usually the case with the internet, but rather a case-by-case approach that rests on the principle that it's important that these tools remain open and accessible to as many people as possible.
You walked through 4 primary examples, and I think folks were interested in your invitation to think about other examples, and China came to mind for a couple of people. I think it's pretty obvious. I'm sure it's an obvious one that you've thought about. I mean, in a very broad way, if you could talk a little bit and account for the way that the Chinese government has developed its relationship with the internet, I think might be instructive for our audience, and also maybe specifically address the question of whether China works the refs, as I think some people say they might, to get critical messages taken down off of some of the social media platforms that are specific to that country. And is that a big problem?
So it's interesting when we talk about China, we, and its approach, which is completely different to the internet, and which kind of, I mean, there's a block, obviously, of nations right now who are advocating for another vision of the internet that is not based on openness and collaborative principles, and free principles. So the thing is, how can I say this? It's usually these are governments who have probably another perspective than their citizens. And the way we see this is when you have myriads of apps that are not available in China, theoretically, but I promise, my brother lived in Shanghai for 5 years. I could speak with him on WhatsApp every day, and he was on Facebook. So for me, it was a kind of a signal, and not only my brother, but there are countless examples, research that prove that a lot of people are trying every day to evade censorship in China. And even as we're speaking, I just read a headline. I haven't gone into the details of the news, but I just read that, the government also want to limit the use of TikTok to 40 minutes a day. Well, that's very interesting. Well, which means that people use it. So if people use it, they probably have a different point of view from their government that wants to limit to 40 minutes a day. So all this to say that it's, of course, their governments were, wary of and would have a completely different take on what I've just presented. But I would encourages to keep in mind that this is a government, and this is not necessarily, I mean, we are aware that governments are not always aligned with what the people actually, express through other means. And I think the Chinese example is actually extremely interesting, because on the one hand is being marketed, excuse me the expression, but is being marketed as a valid counterexample or counter possibility to the openness that is advocated by more liberal countries. It's being marketed to countries as a solution. And so countries like Nigeria, for instance, we've learned are considering a firewall a la Chinese. But at the same time, we hear every day about, VPN. Well, Twitter is being banned in Nigeria. People are on Twitter every day. I mean, Nigeria was a trending topic 2 days after that Twitter ban happened, despite the fact that the government had threatened to also ban VPNs. And we're as a reflection of the question that was asked earlier. So yes, just to answer your question, these are interesting examples, and we see really clearly, and I think it's going to be increasingly the case, we're seeing a sort of dichotomy between what we're hearing from the authorities and the regular, sounds and words and, complaints or expression that expression that we receive from Chinese citizens through their apps.
So, kind of continuing somewhat of a comparative perspective, but switching gears a little bit back to the United States. Someone asks, focusing on Section 230, the debate in the United States, at least, is often focused around 230 as being the reason why the internet in the United States is the way it is. Mm-hmm. And this questioner is curious if other countries have similar policies, and if not, what difference the absence of a rule like 230 might make to the way the internet is experienced in other places.
Yes. So I would say that from my knowledge, at least the context that I'm more familiar with, which are European and African context, I am not aware of an equivalent legislation to that of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. But instead, what we're seeing more, I mean, we went from a space where a gray area, okay? Governments didn't really know, how I don't even think we had a conversation. I remember the first conversation that we really had nationwide in France about internet and platforms was when they were discussing the Copyrights Act, well, kind of a Copyrights Act that's called Hadopi, that was basically here to prevent you from file sharing. You remember the peer-to-peer system when you could download those long files that took forever to download. Yeah, so that was the first real conversation that I remember we really had about content and the internet development. So we moved from that to, oh my God, in 2018, oh my God, there is hate speech, there is disinformation, we need a law. And that's where we are right now in a lot of places around the world. I'm thinking, for instance, about, of course, the very famous German example that, kicked off this trend of trying to grasp this, content, how to regulate content online, right? And many countries followed suit, including France, although the law was, tweaked by the Constitutional Court, and many other examples, recently India. So we've really transitioned from a place where we didn't really know to a place that, oh, there is a problem and we need to act on it right now without even having the necessary data that could back up that whatever we're proposing is actually going to be effective. So that's why I'm personally really involved in this debate generally, because I think there are lots of dangers for us to be hyper-focused on Section 230 in the US, or hyper-focused on fighting hate speech and fake news by asking takedowns from platforms. So it's a really interesting moment where it's possible to try to propose things and try to sit at a table together and collaborate. I think we really need that right now, because otherwise the discussion is going to be pretty much the same years, 10 years from now, unfortunately. So yeah.
Maintaining a little bit of an American-centric focus. And I have one more question from an audience member about some of the legal reforms that are gaining steam and gaining traction in this country. Antitrust, as I'm sure we're all aware. As a general point, do you think it would be good for democracy, not only here, but in other countries around the world, if we were to break up the big tech companies?
So obviously, democracy is not synonymous with concentration of power. So as a principle, I am of those who are saying there must be as many counterbalances as possible. Either they be institutional counterpowers or market player counterpowers. I mean, I think it's necessary to talk about in general about counterbalancing and counterpowers to big tech in general, but I would say the same in other sectors of activity, especially if they have such an impact on our discourses, our public discourses, and the stability of our institutions. So the antitrust debate, in my opinion, is, I don't know, I feel like recently it's been presented as not really a discussion about that, but really a discussion about solving content. Because if we have more players, we're going to have less. I mean, we probably gonna have less content problems. And it's that analogy that I find, I don't know, I'm still deciphering. I don't have a definitive point of view on that, but I think it's too dangerous for me to narrow it only to that, because this is not, I mean, the bigger conversation that I really hope we can have more in the future is how to make sure that we are there are necessary checks and balances, if you will, in this new space, new virtual territory, in which, those big techs, they're growing, and it's only normal when you're growing. I would say it's natural, it's human nature to want more and to want everything, right? So yes, I think that conversation, antitrust as a checks and balances mechanism, excuse me for the analogy, but I just want to make it simple in the interest of time. But yes, that conversation is interesting, and I look forward to seeing more takes on that.
That's really interesting. Just sort of following up on this discussion, I mean, sort of stepping outside of just antitrust, it seems that a lot of the momentum, or at least the interest in antitrust, like you said, it's not necessarily just about antitrust. It's about trying to deal with other problems using that lens. And I think a lot of people are interested in the responsibilities that big companies like Facebook and Twitter's not that big of a company, but Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Google, what responsibilities they have. And so I'm curious, especially since you're part of the oversight board, if you could talk about assuming these companies do have some responsibilities in the public sphere, what are those responsibilities, and what are reasonable enforcement mechanisms, whether those be public or private, like the oversight board?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Morgan, for that question. And it allows me to share with you something that I'm trying to say at every occasion. So we all know from reports, including recently, I think Freedom House has just published its Freedom of the Net report. So we know that democracy is shrinking worldwide, online and offline, and both are interconnected. So when you say that, what does it mean? It means that while traditionally governments are the institutions that are responsible for ensuring that we're living in this democratic space, that in the situation where we are, where democracy is in danger, calls for more actors to jump in, especially more actors who have an impact on that society, positive or negative. And I think on that, private sector in general, and social media companies in particular, or big tech, have definitely a responsibility, but I also have a responsibility as a citizen. So with that being said, what does it concretely mean? And you mentioned our role at my role at the Oversight Board. What's interesting with the Facebook Oversight Board is that we are trying to propose what applying human rights in this digital space that is growing and becoming so much more important, and sometimes that goes even before governments. I mean, we've seen examples in which tech companies have been more responsive than governments. COVID gave plenty of examples of that, for instance. So how can we make sure that the rights and all these rights that we have proclaimed that virtually humanity has agreed on? I think we all in the world agree that expressing oneself is important. The interpretation is not the same everywhere, but at least the principle is proclaimed everywhere in probably every constitution in the world. So once you say that, what does it mean in the virtual world? And that's a very interesting part of the Oversight Board, is that we're trying to propose some elements. What does it mean to protect, to balance freedom of expression with safety when deleting a very big account on a social media platforms, which happens also to be an account important for democracy debate, political debate. So, or what does it mean to actually protect the right against, to protect users against discrimination, against hate speech, while at the same time allowing that speech, even the most offensive one? Should we even do that? So these are questions that are extremely important and that I'm really, glad to work on and to reflect on almost every day, especially these past few weeks. But it's a fascinating endeavor, and I'm personally quite enthused by what's coming up next, because I'm sure this is just the beginning of plenty of others solutions that will come up and try to frame what does it mean actually to have human rights while being online.
Sort of building on the discussion about the relationship between, developing democracies, authoritarian countries, and their relationship with these tech companies. One of our audience members is curious if the countries themselves have the technical capacity to block the internet writ large or particular social platforms within their borders, or do the companies have to cooperate in order for that to happen?
That's an extremely important question, which reminds me that I actually wanted to talk about that internet shutdowns, to explain the extent to which connectivity has become so important from a political point of view, especially in elections, that governments tend to rely on internet shutdowns during election period, especially contested ones. So there are different ways to censor or shut down access to internet. So there is a full blackout internet. And this is varying. So we went from 2017 when authorities in Cameroon, where I was born, actually went with a physical, how do you call that? Something to cut, to cut the wood. I forgot the name in English.
An axe?
An axe, thank you.
Yeah.
They went with a physical axe to one of the landing points on the coast of Cameroon to physically cut the, the cable. We went from that, and that caused a lot of problems and a lot of outrage and a lot of economic consequences, because, banks use internet as well, and everything virtually uses internet now. So we went from that to, okay, we have to be a bit more clever. So we'll force rather. So, telecommunications operator, internet service providers to cut off technically that, because many of the government, especially the authoritarian ones, or at least those that have an internet infrastructure that is not as developed as in the US, for instance, those countries do not have, as we are talking, probably that's changing, and I think, but they don't have the technical capacity in-house. So they will rely on telcos, which happen to also be internet service providers. And so we have seen a scenario quite worrying, such as, those, leaders from these telcos actually being physically arrested and forced to order whatever whatever censorship they have. What is interesting in that is that there are initiatives currently to try to help companies navigate when this situation presents itself. So there is I'm thinking particularly about the Global Network Initiative, which is a global forum for companies, civil society organizations, and academia to discuss and work together on freedom of expression and privacy challenges that are faced by the companies. And this organization has developed a set of guidelines to help companies respond to law enforcement requests such as this one. And the other way to practice censorship online, and which is increasingly popular, is that instead of cutting the whole internet in the whole country, you can either target certain regions, like it happened in Cameroon again, but also like it happened in Ethiopia recently, where the Tigray region, where there is an ongoing conflict, the internet was cut off over there. So you have this scenario we're only going to cut off Facebook and Twitter, because frankly, these are the platforms that are mostly problematic, especially in elections, especially for governments that are trying to hide potential irregularities. So we went from that, and for that as well, the telcos need to play a role. And again, there are guidelines. There are certain telcos that respect those guidelines because they're a member of the Global Network Initiatives, which allow us to share practices, but also alert them and advocate internally for them not to comply with orders and help them navigate that. But you have many telcos that are not members. So that's why you continue to see a lot of censorship orders that are not challenged in court or whatsoever. Although at my organization and at many organizations, we have been trying to push that into courts. And that's why I was saying it's important to include also the judiciary into the conversation around internet democracy, because by pushing those lawsuits against governments when an internet shutdown happens against government and telcos, we actually can secure, that never happens again, hopefully. And if not that, at the minimum, we will shed more light on the process that has led to the censorship. So who gave the order? Sometimes you don't even know that. You just know this government, but there are different entities within the government. And it allows you to verify whether the request was legal, whether the right authority made the request, and so on, and so many other issues. So yes, just to say that there are different ways to go about it. And we're also trying to push that in court and gather evidence in order to make sure this doesn't happen again.
So when you say your organization, I assume you're referring to Internet Sans Frontières.
Yes,
and
exactly.
that's maybe a good opportunity to educate our audience a little bit about what that organization does. And it sounds like you're actively engaged in litigation. But yeah, anything else that you guys are doing we'd love to hear about.
Yes. So we're mostly engaged in advocacy, I have to admit, and policy, policy advocacy particularly. So helping platforms, governments adopt the right rules and implement them the right way. We also do a lot of advocacy for internet access, and that's why I insisted on connectivity as a right, because as we are speaking, half of the population worldwide still doesn't have access to internet, and that is a problem. So we have advocacy programs, but we also have grassroots programs. So we had a connectivity program making sure to narrow the digital gender gap, because there is the inequalities that we know offline are exactly the same online. So we have a program on that. We have a program on the policy side that I was mentioning, which is related to content. So fighting hate speech and fake news on social media platforms in a way that is respectful of human rights. This is really something that I've been pushing at my organization and at other, other settings where I've been working. And we also, last but not least, do, we provide services to companies also. When I say services, it's first of all research, and that's how we finance ourselves partly, but also through membership, membership contributions. But we also have some services that we provide for responsible technologies. And we, last but not least, help litigating. So this is something we're really new at, and we're focusing right now on internet shutdowns. But it's something that has proved to be so efficient in so many other subjects. Privacy is one of the examples. Consumer protection is another one, which is another great way of going about these issues around internet freedoms. So yes, this is a new place where we're trying to be active as well.
Since we're almost out of time, I'll ask you one more question that sort of dovetails. You mentioned fake news, and so this is maybe a hard question, but do you think the social media companies should be more aggressive in fighting fake news? And epistemologically, who gets to decide what's true and false?
So I would start with the first one, who gets to decide? Absolutely. That is a urgent question that I hope we will find an answer to very soon. Because right now, those who are deciding are in Silicon Valley, for some of them, and others are in newsrooms that are in, in Western countries a lot. So yeah, who gets to decide on the one hand? And that brings me to and in many other places, it's governments deciding actually through the law, deciding what is fake. And that is extremely dangerous. The example of India and the response, well, the lack of response rather, to the COVID crisis, and how it has forced social media companies to delete criticism about that response is a matter of concern. So no, I don't think we should push companies to, that's not the discussion for me. Pushing companies to delete is not that, it's not the problem, and it's not the solution. It's not the way to go about these issues. That's what I fundamentally believe. Rather, what we should focus on is, yes, who is at the table deciding what is allowed or what is not? Who are we hearing on the one hand? And on the other hand, how are we working together to not only solve technologically the problem, because hate speech is not a technological problem only. It is of course pushed by the machine today and the rapidity, the speed of circulation of information, but it remains that we live in societies that are extremely unequal. And that is not only for Facebook or Twitter to solve just by deleting. That's my opinion.
Thank you, Julie. I'll turn it back over to Michael, but that was very illuminating.
Thank you, Morgan. And I wanted to thank you particularly for this extreme, well-crafted organization. And it was really easy on me. Thank you. And thank you.
My pleasure.
So thank you very much, Julie, both for the talk and for the extremely interesting responses to those questions. So if we were in person, which I wish we were, I would invite everybody to join with me to thank Julie for that outstanding talk, but maybe we can do that digitally. I imagine people, it's just like Zen, it's like it's the sound of no hands clapping, right, over Zoom. But thank you very much, and appreciate the attention that the audience has given. The next Constitutional Law Center program is on October 6th, and this is our annual Supreme Court preview and review, where we invite three practitioners, very prominent appellate advocates from different points of view to talk about both what happened in the term behind us, and also, more importantly, what's happening in the term ahead of us. So that'll be October 6th at, I believe it's 5 p.m. Look forward to seeing many of you there as well. So thank you very much. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Morgan, for all your hard work. And good night.